I walked into the kitchen and saw them. My husband with my mother. Two people who were supposed to be the anchors of my life, sitting too close, hands brushing as if the whole world had slipped sideways. The light above the table caught the back of my mother's neck, and the way his fingers lingered at the base of her thumb. And in that instant, the room turned to ice. There was no explanation that could make what I saw clean. There was only the knowledge that my life had been rearranged without my permission. Kindly subscribe our channel so we can work for society to raise awareness of these kinds of stories. Before I say anything else, if you want more of these stories, if these voices from the back rooms of other people's lives matter to you, please support the channel. Like, subscribe, turn on notifications. It keeps the stories coming, and it helps the people telling them be heard. I didn't confront them in that moment. I stood there in the doorway the way a photograph stands still, silent, impossible to move. My husband looked up with that slow, guilty recognition that people show when they know the thing they love can never be unlearned. My mother's smile faltered, and she tried to tuck the implication away with a quietness that made it worse. I left the house the way you leave a burning building, without gathering anything, because you know nothing else can survive the flames. People imagine betrayal happening in a series of loud explosions, an affair confessed in a blazing argument, a scene that makes headlines and breaks plates. Mine was quieter, and therefore more treacherous. 1,000 small shifts until the whole shape of my life was different. The way he began to walk past me without touching my shoulder. The way my mother's visit stretched longer and ended with them sharing a cup of tea in the garden while I washed dishes and pretended not to hear. The way the family calendar was suddenly rearranged so that their lunches lined up and my appointments did not. It was a bureaucratic theft. Affection moved from one ledger to another, and I was recorded as an obsolete entry. They left. The divorce papers were quick, sharp as knives. He did not look like the man I had married. There was a sheen of confidence about him that always sits on people who have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. My mother's eyes, once soft with the memory of my childhood, now glittered with something colder. The exhilaration of someone who has climbed where she should not have. She called me a week before the court date and, with the politeness of someone who is always 2 steps ahead, said, "This will be easier for all of us if we move on." She said it as if we were discussing furniture. Once the papers were signed, everyone assumed the storm would pass. They were wrong. Divorce is a legal instrument. Revenge is an art. I could have used the law to burn them. Public battles, accusations, a messy court smear that would have ruined them both. But I wanted something that left them living with the consequences of their choice, day after day, not spectacular and short-lived exposure. I wanted a life sentence without handcuffs. Social isolation, the slow, corrosive work of turning the comfortable into the uncomfortable. I started small because subtlety keeps power. A call here, a carefully placed question there. I had learned how the town's social web worked. Who took tea with whom? Which neighbors relied on whose car when their own failed? What committee met, where and when? I collected facts like coins, stacking them until I could pay for the truth to be told at the right price. I'd overhear a little thing at the market. Someone mentioning how their sister's cousin worked in a bank branch. And then I'd take that thread and show a very particular interest. People are conveyor belts for information. And if you know how to read the tags on their packages, you can reroute the cargo. One afternoon I began by handling their small humiliations. The charity board where he had a seat rescinded after a few whispered conversations about conflict of interest, the subtle erosion of invitations, the garden party notes that never arrived. I found out which company liked to contract for local events and quietly made a suggestion that their association might reconsider patronage. A week later, there were fewer smiling faces when he walked in. The economy of appearances matters. If one doorway closes, the echo registers in the rooms beyond. I never gossiped. Rumor imploded if you fed it with spite. I wanted justice, not caricature. I needed their life to constrict because of their own choices, not because people enjoyed my misery. So I found the facts that would get people's attention without sounding like vindictive gossip. Their banking irregularities, small irregularities at first. Late filings, a bill uncleared, a terse email. Looked different when lined up like breadcrumbs. A friend who worked at a legal aid office found it convenient to mention practices of interest to someone who bought my sympathy at the right hour. The cocktail of coincidence and attention yields results if you let it. Meanwhile, my mother handled the social scene with the practiced grace of a woman who had been queen of the neighborhood for years. She smiled at old acquaintances. She volunteered at the library with a neat, disarming enthusiasm. She brought scones to the church ladies and made sure the jam was homemade. Her polish gleamed. But Polish wears thin under the right conditions. I learned the details of her life the way you learn an instrument. By repetition. I asked questions that made her reveal the seams. How did you and A meet at the club? Do you remember when we used to? She filled in the blanks, and those blanks became names on lists. The town loved a scandal dressed in other people's misfortune, but it loved a redeeming story even more. So I framed mine as a cautionary tale of loyalty. The kind of narrative that looks moral from a distance. I presented evidence to people who cared about honesty in business. A director at the local charity. An old friend who ran a column in the weekly paper. The trick was not to accuse loudly. It was to show gently that the standard they'd trusted had been compromised. Gentle persuasion carries more audience than a shout, because the mind prefers to believe it's being reasonable, not swayed. There were nights when the weight of what I did pressed on me. Revenge wears you as much as it wears them. There's no avoiding the mirror. I would stand in my kitchen at midnight and think about the way my daughter used to climb into my lap and ask embarrassing questions about life. The woman who had been my child now sat beside the man who had been my husband, and for months I had cultivated plots that chipped away at that newly built domestic throne. It is dangerous work, the kind that teaches you the spectrum of your own moral flexibility. But do not confuse my resolve with cruelty. Everything I did was a strategic boundary, one that they had already crossed. They lost friends. Some relationships buckled and then snapped. Others were quietly pried loose through careful reminders. Have you checked their accounts? I heard Mr. X had an audit last year. You'd be surprised how many people will abandon a table if they think the food is tainted. Social circles are fragile because they are based on mutual confidence. Once confidence breaks, the group seeks to minimize association. A dozen small nudges, a few well-timed uncertainties, and the social climate turned against them. Then a more formal bolt came, the kind you can't weave back into normalcy as easily. A complaint from an employee at his firm about irregular expense claims, not direct theft, nothing dramatic, but enough that his board began to ask uncomfortable questions. Paperwork was requested. An internal audit was announced. He was not a fool. He thought he had prepared for this. But the net was closing, and he could not smooth a single wrinkle from the fabric of reality he had created. My mother tried to act above it, but few people wear shame well. She was still the same woman who made calls and arranged visits, but there were fewer hands that reached back when she offered tea. Invitations dwindled. Her garden parties shrank. Where before she had been the hostess with 100 small allegiances, now she had 1 or 2 loyal souls, and the polite distance of acquaintances who had nothing to lose by stepping away. But the law is a slow animal. While the company audit worked its way like a dull legal plow through their finances, I collected proof and kept it safe. In one brown envelope I put the receipts that made the oddities sing. Receipts for business lunches, where names did not match accounts, invoices for events that never took place, check deposits with odd memos. I did not publish. I did not yell. I let the bank statements be their own kind of voice. When the paper trail reached the right desks, auditors who have nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with numbers, it had the clarity of truth. The day the auditors came to speak with me, I did not act surprised. I gave them the folder in my hands, watched their brows knit, watched the clicking and clacking of keyboards as they confirmed what 100 small decisions had already suggested. Regulatory bodies move more slowly than rumor, but they move with more certainty. A formal inquiry is a lever that pulls down both reputation and revenue. A company's smile is hard to maintain when the ledger reads differently. I watched them both shrink under scrutiny. My husband tried to play the aggrieved entrepreneur, mismanaged and hard-pressed. My mother tried to be the understanding spouse who loved someone who had given everything to their community. Neither line held. Facts have a sharpness that rhetoric cannot dull. The audit found misallocated funds and a pattern of minor fraud. Enough to trigger fines. Enough to make boards uncomfortable. Not all disasters are cinematic. Some are arithmetic. Revenue missing here, expense claims there. A paper trail that maps motives without saying the word. He lost his seat on the charitable board. Contracts were withdrawn. His business was shaken to its core. The particular sting was not the financial toll, although that was significant. It was the slow erosion of prestige. Prestige is often more valuable than cash in small towns. Once the mirror of public respect cracks, everything else looks cheap. My mother, who had once been the wellspring of neighborhood gossip and admiration, became a cautionary tale at garden parties. She let love blind her judgment, people said, their voices soft with disapproval. All of this could have been enough. A social death, a business collapse. But I wanted them to understand fully what it meant to live with the consequences of their choices. So I pushed gently in another direction. The family narrative. Families are fragile myths, stories told and retold until they seem eternal. I started to reframe that myth in ways that made their roles difficult to sustain. I spoke to relatives with quiet, precise observations about their behavior, not accusations. I said things like, when she spoke to me in the summer of 17, she mentioned a trip he'd taken with a female friend. Did you know about that? Those small plantings grow into forests if you water them with attentive ears. My daughter, no, my child, was initially a fortress of loyalty. I will not pretend she was passive. She had reasons, affection, confusion, the intoxicating sensation of being chosen by an adult. That is a different wound from sexual appetite. It is a wound of misplaced validation. But loyalty strains under public pressure. When invitations stop, when people no longer call, when the private narrative is replaced by public records and cold bank numbers, even the most fervent love begins to look like a risky currency. One evening, after a town meeting, my daughter cornered me in the stairwell. It was the first time since the divorce she had spoken without lawyers and without the dampers of social pretense. Her voice was small. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "We're happy. Isn't that enough?" I looked at her and saw both the child who used to break my favorite teacups and the adult who now sat in restaurants beside the man who had been my husband. I said, "Happiness built on theft does not last. What you have is not just a romance. It is the theft of a lifetime." She did not like the word theft. She said, "Love is love." I saw the point where words failed her, where sentiment meets consequence, and I knew then that the only way forward was to let consequences outpace rhetoric. When the first criminal complaint was filed, small penalties for accounting fraud escalated to more serious charges because of the consistency of records. The media took notice. The paper that had never printed my name without margins now ran a sober piece. It wasn't about me. It was about greed, the slow erosion of trust. But the headline always burned in the corners of evenings. "Local entrepreneur under investigation." My mother's name was in the subtext. People love a clear story. Hero, villain, lesson. In the end, their supposed happiness read like an imprudent gamble. The legal fights were messy. They fought back with lawyers whose job was to produce fog. When you build your life on small, selfish acts, lawyers try to manufacture uncertainties. My husband's team argued that the discrepancies were bookkeeping errors, that auditors read patterns where none existed. My mother's defense was a combination of devotion and embarrassment, as if a confused devotion could absolve financial misdeeds. But facts persisted. Emails, bank statements, and a paper trail refused the neatness of their rhetoric. When evidence aligns, it becomes a truth that even sympathy struggles to reshape. There were nights when I wanted nothing more than to stop, to let them go on their own way, to savor the empty rooms in peace, to sleep without the motor hum of scheming in the back of my brain. But I knew the cost of silence. I had been living it already. Silence had been the platform upon which they built their life. If I let silence return, I would have been the architect of my own erasure. So I continued, not with malice for its own sake, but with a steady, stubborn insistence that choices are visible and must be met with consequences. At the apex of it all, after fines, after public embarrassment, after the slow evaporation of friendships, my husband's business declared insolvency. Partners pulled back. The bank called in loans. He was not arrested for violent crime. He was ruined financially, ethically, and publicly. My mother's health, which she herself had always used as a soft shield for attention, faltered under the strain. Pride is a demanding disease. When pride is gone, a person's immune system sometimes follows. I did not rejoice in their literal suffering. In private moments, when what remained of my tenderness surfaced unexpectedly, I would think of them as human beings who had made catastrophic choices. But there is a thin line between pity and forgetting, and I had walked that line already when I let them take what was mine. What I wanted was restitution, not cash, not vindication, but to see that the structure built in my absence could not endure on stolen bricks. The town's chorus softened. People returned to ordinary routines. The charity board accepted new members. Garden parties resumed with new hosts. The social ecosystem adapted and found new balances. I watched it all from my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a warm mug, and felt the oddest mixture of exhaustion and relief. The campaign had been long and often lonely, But it had worked in the precise way I had intended. Not to humiliate for spectacle, but to reroute their life through the consequences they had chosen. Years later, they both live in quieter places. My ex-husband found work managing a small shop across town. He keeps his head down. My mother moved into a smaller apartment where the kettle boils. But there are fewer invitations to fill. They are not destitute in the tabloid sense, but the currency they most valued, respect, did not return to them easily. It is a strange kind of exile, not one of walls and bars, but one of memory and social distance. They cast long shadows when they cross my path. Some nights I see them in the market and pretend not to notice. It is easier that way. And me? I kept my life. I repaired what broke in the quiet ways women learn when they have to. I learned to sleep again. I learned to answer to myself. I did not emerge unscarred. That is impossible. But I grew a kind of late peace that is different from joy. It is steadiness, the steady awareness that the future is mine to shape now. My daughter, no longer by his side, reconnected slowly, cautiously. We spoke with the careful, honest conversations that do the work of years. She carried her own shame and had to earn back our small family's trust. But she chose to. And that choice mattered in the way it always does. The story most people imagine about revenge is a crescendo. A shout, a public falling, then silence. Mine was not that kind of music. It was a long, slow rearrangement of life's furniture. A remodeling done by the incremental pressure of consequences. I did not make their life hell by petty cruelty. I made it unlivable for those who build dreams on theft, lies, and the hollowing out of trust. That alone is justice enough for me. If you ask me now whether I regret it, sometimes in the cold hours a part of me misses the man who once held my hand. But then I remember the long nights when he turned his back, and the small, patient cruelty of a woman who smiled as she planned your erasure. Regret is a complicated creature, and I live with it the way we live with our weather. It passes. It returns. But seasons change. And so the end of this chapter is not triumphant in the way a movie might sell it. It is simple. I kept my dignity. They paid the price of their choices. And in the quiet after the uproar, I kept living. That for me has been the truest form of victory.